and welcome to RCA Radio, a podcast where we cover the latest news and challenges in regulatory, compliance, and quality assurance facing the life science industries. I'm your host, Brandon Miller. In this episode of RCA Radio, we'll be going over how to deal with laboratory out-of-specification investigations. Today, I'm joined by Walter Mason, Senior Director of Quality and Consulting Services here at RCA. Welcome, Walter.
Hello, Brandon, and it's good to be here today.
It's great to have you back. We really appreciate you helping us make these podcasts. So we can just jump right in it today. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit, teach the audience a little bit more about what kind of things they can expect when dealing with these OOS investigations. And just to start, what is an OSS investigation? What causes them? And why are they important to address right away?
Okay. Well, first of all, in the release for sale of any pharmaceutical product or biologic product, there has to be some testing done on that product. Normally, that's done on the final product. Occasionally, there is an analytical result. It might be chemistry, it might be micro, that doesn't meet the specification. And those are referred to as out-of-specification results. It is the expectation from the FDA and the company's responsibility to investigate those. After all, let's say, as an example, I have an internal spec of 95 to 105% of the label claim of a product, and I get a result that's 92 or 112, then that is out of the specification range. I need to investigate that to understand why. I can't release the product if it doesn't meet the specification. Now, there are other things that go into the release of the product besides the testing, but today we're just specifically talking.
What does the FDA say about these types of investigations? And do they have any guidance documents our listeners could check out to help them prepare?
Yes, actually there are. Well, first of all, there's a 21 CFR reference. There are 3 sections in 21 CFR Part 211 that people need to review. 211.160, 211.165, and 211.192. So those are the sections that pertain to out-of-spec results, the expectation from the FDA from a legal perspective. The FDA issued a guidance document on how to conduct an out-of-specification investigation in 2006. And I'm not going to really talk about that much other than to say 2 things about it. The first thing I'd say about it is that everyone who works in a laboratory should discuss that or have a discussion about that at least once a year. I know many people who work in a lab have read it at one time in their life. They follow the company's SOPs, but it's a good reminder for people. The second thing I would say about it is there is one sentence in this guidance document which everyone needs to always remember, and that is laboratory errors should be infrequent. So that's what the FDA really says about it. There are other ways people can find information. Of course, a lot of people do internet searches, and there are a lot of tools available to people.
Okay. And coming from somebody that's gone in and helped companies address these investigations, what are some best practices you found, and how do you really just perform a good investigation, and what should people look out for?
Let me start by saying, let me back up just a minute. A product can be released when it doesn't meet the specification in one of 3 ways. And we're just going to talk about the third way, basically. The first is it can be accidental, right? It can be fraudulent, or it can be an inadequate investigation. I want to read just a minute some excerpts from a warning letter that was issued on September 30th of this year, 2021, to Missouri Analytical Laboratories. This is a public document. It's been redacted. Anyone can go to the FDA website and read it. There are several sections to this. I'm just going to touch on a few. And it said they had a failed test. It says your laboratory investigation did not determine a root cause for the failure. You relied on sampling and retesting to invalidate the original OOS result out of specification without identifying a scientifically justified root cause. They have some others here that are interesting. Your firm failed to detect and thoroughly investigate falsification of records. So in this particular case, we have two of the three that I just mentioned. They had inadequate investigations and they released product, and they falsified records. So this is a double whammy for the company and something that's very serious. Actually, for falsification of records, there are a lot of FDA-imposed penalties for that for individuals and for companies. One of the things that the FDA asked this company to do, they said they wanted an independent review of all invalidated OOS results. And that means they have to go hire someone like RCA to perform that independent review. So that's really how the FDA views OOS results and their expectations.
So do you have any best practices to address these investigations or any recommendations from your personal experience on how somebody can prepare?
Yes, but there are a lot of tools out there. Some people like to use a fishbone. Some people use 8D, and there are other tools as well. And it really doesn't make any difference which tool someone uses. Most companies have defined which tools they want people to use. However, I think it's more important for people to understand the advantages and the limitations of the tools that they're using and how they approach using the tools. Let me give you an example. I've reviewed a lot of investigations in my life, and to me, there are three things that stand out that are a detriment to a success of a good investigation. The first one is rigidly following the tool without thinking about it. And I'll give some examples of that. Another thing is people who have conclusions that don't match the problem or they don't identify a root cause. The third thing is a poorly written investigation report. And I think most people forget two things. Number one, they don't know who the audience is for the reports. And the second thing I think they forget about is that the reviewer, and let's say in this case it's an FDA investigator, is very skeptical when they review the report. And as anyone who goes into a situation that I start out, I'm skeptical about the results. So part of this is the report has to gain that person's trust by how it's written. And if you don't have the trust, then of course you don't believe the results. So let me start with the first one, people who rigidly follow the tool. And I've seen this so many times. It's almost mind-boggling the wasted effort a lot of companies go to when they rigidly follow a tool. And one has to be careful with this because the tools are good. They should be used. They should be followed. But they have to be analyzed at each step I take in the use of that tool. So as an example, there are several questions I think that people have to ask the question. And the first one is, am I force-fitting the information just to be able to fill in all the boxes? And you don't know how many times I've seen this. So, I've got to fill in each box or each section with a lot of detail. Otherwise, it's incomplete. Well, this is a real example. This company was using a fishbone. And one of the sections talk about the instruments, are the instruments or the method good? And they spent probably a page and a half in the report putting in details that said, yes, it's okay. It can be done with one or two sentences. In this particular case, This was an HPLC run. It was a series run of 5 sets of samples. One sample was out of spec, the others were all in spec. So I asked the question, what is the probability of the instrument, the column, and the method being inadequate if I have 5 of the 6 results within specification? So it tells me, first of all, it met the system suitability test. The instrument's working properly. The method is good. It's a validated method. It's working fine. And the analyst could have made a mistake in preparing that sample. But as far as the instrument is concerned and the column is concerned and the method is concerned, it's okay. That's all that needs to be stated instead of writing many paragraphs on why the instrument it's properly calibrated, everything is done. So it's a matter of analyzing what I need to do and saying, is there any other information that is available that tells me it's working, as opposed to going through a very rigorous process? So that's one thing. Now, sometimes you have to go through the rigorous process. As an example, in another case, it was a single sample. So I don't have any other data. I can't compare it with anything else. Therefore, under those circumstances, I need to go through that rigorous look at the instrument and the column. So it's always one of those cases. It depends on what the sample is. Another question that has to be asked is, does it make sense? Is this really plausible? On another investigation, there was a high OOS result. I don't remember now exactly what it was, but it was well out of spec. One of the hypotheses that was proposed in writing and included in the investigation report was that someone might have spilled some solution in. And it's like, okay, are you serious? Because if I spill something in it, unless that what I spilled in it had a concentration of that product in it greater than what it had, that's impossible. Most of the things that would have been spilled in it would dilute it and give me a low result. So it didn't make sense to include that as a possible solution. This is another example of blindly following the process. And this occurs time and time again. Now, in that particular report, there was something that was left out as well. As an example, the conclusion was that something was spilled in the vial. The vial wasn't handled properly. Yet, in no section of the report did it say how the vials were handled. Therefore, as a reviewer, I don't know if that was even feasible or not, or if there was anything around that had a concentration that might increase it. By the way, and that was the conclusion from it. And as far as I'm concerned, they didn't have a conclusion. They didn't have a root cause, even though they call that the root cause. They didn't even have a probable cause for that. So if I were an FDA investigator and I read that, I would have written them up. Now, another one. Let me give you another example about, does it make sense? They're running a series, and again, HPLC, but with one sample, there was nothing that showed up on the chromatogram. Nothing. Blank. Baseline all the way. Well, that tells me immediately that nothing was injected. And when they looked at it, they found out that the needle had pushed the septum in the vial. Therefore, no liquid was withdrawn because it didn't penetrate the septum. It was just stuck in it. And nothing was there. And yet, in the investigation, they rigidly followed every piece of what they were taught was the proper way to perform an investigation. And it was a lot of wasted effort because it was obvious what the problem was. They knew the conclusion. That was a good conclusion. And so they did, in fact, have a root cause for that. I've also seen root causes and conclusions that ignored the problem. You have to match the root cause with what the problem is. And in this case, they went off kind of in what I'll refer to as left field. They should have gone to right field, went exactly the opposite direction. And again, as a reviewer, I said, you didn't investigate. The investigation was incomplete. You don't know what the root cause is. And that one was blatant. So those are things, that people have to take a look at. Let me give one more example. And this was an interesting situation. This was a tablet process. It was released for sale but not shipped, which turned out to be a blessing to the company. They put it on special stability. And the reason they put it on special stability was because during the storage of this lot and before it was packaged, there was a significant power failure that lasted several days. So the temperature rose, the humidity rose, and things were out. But they tested it, it met all the specifications, and they packaged it, released it for sale, but it had not left their warehouse. And that's the part which is a blessing. On the 3-month stability, it failed dissolution testing. And this kind of tells you the thought process of some investigations. The first analyst ran it failed, ran it with the same solutions, which is normal. It failed. The second analyst ran it and it with passing results. But they continued with the investigation, and they did a good job with the rest of them. They did everything they should have. They looked at everything. This was a series, a campaign batch. They found some others, another batch that was out of specification that was still within their purview. And they rejected those batches, by the way, which was the right decision. But they left some things out of the report, which would have been flags. The first one was they didn't determine a root cause, and they didn't say they didn't have a root cause. So that's a problem to start with. They didn't mention anything about the bulk product stability. The investigation was pretty thorough. They left a few things out. And in a case like this, they might not have a root cause, but they surely have a probable cause, because my guess is that none of the other batches which passed everything and were distributed were not in the plant at the time they had the power failure. So there is a tie. The batches that they did reject were not packaged off during the power failure. Everything else was out of the facility. So I think they kind of shortchanged the investigation. Now, there's kind of a side issue with this, which I'd like to bring up. In dissolution testing, normally you test 6 tablets. If one is out of spec or slightly out of spec, or however the specification is written, you go to what's referred to as an S2 level. You test an additional 6, and if need to, you go to an S3 level. Well, in this case, there were failures in both of the levels that were not bad, but nevertheless, they're failures. And of course, they did the right thing. They went to the S3 level and they rejected the batches. But those numbers that show up, even on the good batches, tell you something. So let's say, as an example, every tablet needs to have a minimum value of 80% of the label claim during the dissolution test. And you have a couple that are in the 70s or might have one in the 60s, and that still meets the requirements, depending on how the requirements are written, that I average those and I can release the batch. But those numbers tell you something about the tablets. And that's something that I think people forget. It might not be appropriate for any given investigation, or it might be batches that have passed and they're fine. But by keeping those numbers in mind tells you something about the process that's used to make the product, and it tells you something about the method that's used to test it. Those are critical pieces, I think, to making the process better in the long term. Now, the second thing, the conclusions don't match the data or they don't have a root cause. I've already mentioned some examples of that. And just want to remind people that the data must always support the conclusion. And it has to be a scientific conclusion. It can't be a guess. Sometimes I don't know the answer, and that's a probable cause. But remember, in the FDA guidance document, it says that laboratory errors should be rare. And some companies I know have a lot of those. The report. This is the critical part. And the first thing is, who's the audience for the report? I know that most people who write the investigations are lab people, lab-related people. No one's ever told them who the audience is. And the audience turns out to be people like me, like FDA investigators. That's the audience. And of course, the internal reviewers are also the audience. It isn't for the person who wrote it. So it has to be written with that in mind. It's the same thing if you're writing a novel, as an example. If I'm a writer and I write a novel, I'm writing for a particular audience. Or if I'm making a movie, I'm making it for a particular audience. And so I cater to that audience. And that doesn't mean that when I write a report, I say anything that isn't true, but I want things to be presented in a manner which a knowledgeable person can follow. And a knowledgeable person should be able to follow a report from beginning to end with minimum questions. And really the report should say, we have a problem, we identified the problem, we investigated the problem, and we've identified a root cause or a probable cause, and we took steps to resolve that. We hope that the problem will never come up again. There are some red flags in reports that reviewers look at and makes them suspicious. And again, I mentioned a while ago about trust. If I'm reading a report, I need to trust that the information that is in the report, the data that's there, is all correct. So the first red flag is careless mistakes. And I've seen this so many times. There'll be spelling. I've seen data on different pages that's supposed to be the same, but it's different, even though it's labeled as the same. Significant figures in data. Sometimes there'll be 2 or 3, sometimes 5 or 6, and it should be consistent. Terminology that's used that may be specific for that plant that nobody else understands, that needs to be defined. Data that's not clearly identified, especially in tables, is another common red flag. I've seen reports where all the reviewers and approvers signed it on the same day. It's like, did you really review it? And I can tell if some of these other things are present that they didn't review it. They simply signed it. I've seen data that's included in reports that has no relationship to the problem. It's just stuck in, and it's hard sometimes to figure out why. People have made wild hypotheses, and one of those, as an example, is, gee, I accidentally diluted this, but I got a high number. I got a high out-of-spec result. And of course, the data must support the root cause. As we saw in the warning letter that was issued, there's no root cause given or no explanation on why I don't know it. And occasionally I won't know. One thing that I've seen frequently for root cause is inadequate training. They'll say, well, the analyst wasn't properly trained, or the method is inadequate. It's like, wait a minute. Part of the responsibility is to train people appropriately. The method is supposed to be a validated method for that particular product. So unless something unusual happens or changes have occurred, then the person should be adequately trained and the method should be validated. The reports need to be clear, concise, include all the data so that the reviewer can reach the same conclusion as the conclusion that is written in the report. and of course, free of confusing jargon. I want to repeat that part. It needs to be clear, concise, including all the data so that the reviewer can reach the same conclusion as the person who wrote the report. One thing also, caution people when they review these reports is if the auditor reaches a different conclusion than you did, then you have a serious problem. And that's occurred, that's spelled out in this warning letter I just referred to. The report is just as important as the experimentation that's done to get the data for that report. So that's kind of a nutshell of things that people need to look out for and really pay attention to.
Wow, those were all great examples and some really, really great tips on what to look out for during these investigations. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap this up?
Just one thing. If you were to walk into any QC lab in any company, most of the people you would see in there are young people, and they're smart, and they work hard, but they're inexperienced. And these are the people who are going to be doing part of the investigation. And most of them haven't been well trained in conducting the investigation. It's not, and again, it has nothing to do with their intellectual ability. It's simply there isn't an adequate training program within the company to prepare people to conduct a good investigation. And I think that's something that companies should really focus on. And I know that part of this is only built on experience. I understand that. And that's why a laboratory supervisor or manager should always be involved in the investigations so they can help people who are less experienced learn from what they're doing and what possibilities might exist, and not blindly follow some checklist. Checklists are good, by the way. I'm not saying that checklists are not good, but there has to be thought in that as well. I had a couple of brother-in-laws who were pilots, both retired, but pilots use checklists all the time, airline pilots, and that's a good thing. But I also know the pilots look for other things that are not on the checklist. And I would expect people in the laboratory to do exactly the same thing. Everything isn't obvious. And so the question has to be asked, if it's not obvious, then what happened? And those are questions, of course, that people can help answer when they gain more experience. So that, as a final thought, yes, please help bring people along by providing adequate training. And this type of training is not a one-time thing. I can't sit down in a classroom or read an SOP and come out and say, I know how to do this. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. So just like the example I mentioned, I think that people should go over the FDA guidance document on OS investigations once a year as a reminder. I think that's quite appropriate to do with anyone who works in a laboratory.
Those are some great parting thoughts. And I want to thank you for taking the time to go over OOS investigations and some of the best practices. And I want to thank our listeners as well for tuning into this episode of RCA Radio. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know when we upload the next episode of RCA Radio. And thanks again and have a great day.